Welcome to Emerge Stronger Post-Pandemic Considerations for Management Teams, presented by the FEI Austin chapter. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, we would like to share some information regarding CPE credits with you, and we appreciate your patience. Today's webinar is worth 1 continuing professional education credit. Please be sure to enable your media player to hear audio. To be eligible for CPE credit, you must answer at least 3 of the 4 polling questions during the webinar and have a total viewing time of at least 50 minutes. Participants will have the opportunity to download their CPE certificate immediately following the webinar if the above requirements are met. In accordance with standards for the National Registry of CPE Sponsors, CPE credit will be granted based on a 50-minute hour. We are unable to grant CPE credit in cases where technical difficulties disqualify eligibility. CPE program sponsorship guidelines prohibit us from issuing credit to those not verified by the technology to have satisfied the minimum requirements listed above. I encourage you to download today's presentation, which is located in the Resources widget on the lower right-hand side of the screen. After the presentation, this webinar will be available on the FEI member site where you can replay and download. After the conclusion of the webinar, your CPE certificate will be available in the certification widget and will also be emailed within 24 hours should you meet the criteria. Below the speaker biography widget is the Q&A box. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation and the speakers will answer as many questions as possible. It's now FEI's pleasure to introduce Gary Chetzron. Gary?
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone and their families are staying safe and healthy. Just wanted to take a couple minutes to thank some people that have been instrumental in putting these webinars together. First of all, thank you to FEI Nationals for their support in getting our webinars scheduled and coordinated. Also, a huge thank you to our unbelievable sponsors that reached out and asked how they could help during this virtual challenging time. And also wanted to mention that Bridgepoint is hosting today's webinar, so thank you guys for that. And also a special thank you to our VP of Programs for the Austin chapter, Zach Fellebaum, and our MVP of the FEI Austin chapter, Jenny Garcia, for coordinating and scheduling our webinars. And with that, I wanted to introduce Ross Goolsby from Bridgepoint. Take it away, Ross. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary, and welcome everybody. I'm Ross Goolsby. I co-lead the Houston office of Bridgepoint Consulting. Bridgepoint Consulting is a management consulting firm based in Austin, Texas. We work with executive teams and private equity sponsors to help companies grow and scale with a focus on finance, accounting, and IT areas. We're excited to be sponsoring today's event, and I'm happy to be the moderator of the panel discussion today. We feel like we've got a really broad spectrum of perspectives today represented by private equity, the Chief Financial Officer Office, and the Chief Information Officer's Office. So with that, let me introduce, or actually have our panelists introduce themselves. We'll start with Michelle Lewis with Capstreet.
Hi, Ross. Thank you for that. This is Michelle Lewis. I am a principal with the lower middle market firm, private equity firm in Houston called the Capstreet Group, where I lead their originations for the firm. Capstreet is a 30-year-old private equity firm that focuses in Texas and the surrounding region, working with entrepreneur and family-owned businesses to provide capital and growth equity to them as we help them professionalize their firms and take them to the next level in the sectors of industrial and business services. Thanks. Glad to be here, Ross.
Thank you, Michelle. Next up is Frank.
Thanks, Ross. This is Frank Stokes. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Castle Biosciences. We're based outside Houston in Friendswood. Castle's a biotechnology company, and we sell high-value diagnostic tests for cancer patients. Our primary driver of growth is a test for patients with cutaneous melanoma or melanoma of the skin.
Thanks, Frank. Now, Craig.
Thanks, Ross. My name is Craig Story. I am the Chief Financial Officer for Very. Very is a 6-year-old company that is mostly known for creating a desktop converter called Veridesk. And we have sold over 3 million of those globally over the last 6 years. We have grown during that period of time from 3 employees to over 350 and are currently shipping to over 30 countries every day. We have expanded our line to include a full suite of workspace products, including flexible walls, conference tables, lighting, soft seating, and other options, and excited to be here.
Thanks, Craig. And last but not least, Vijay.
Hi, Ross. My name is Vijay George. I lead the technology consulting practice for Bridgepoint Consulting overall. I'm a former CIO myself, having been the CIO at a utility as well as state agency. And over the last several weeks, actually over a month now, I've been working with a group of CIOs here, both public and private, trying to understand and plan for the post-COVID-19, what that impact is to companies as far as technology and those kind of things go.
Thank you, Vijay. Thanks, everybody. And thank you to all the panelists who've joined us today. Here is an overview of what we're going to be covering. We're going to be talking about the outlook, the impact of COVID, the outlook post-pandemic, the impact the pandemic's had on various industries and these companies in particular. We're going to look inside private equity and what's going on there, what's happened from an IT perspective. So we're going to touch on a lot of topics today. And for CE purposes, we're going to have some polling questions. So before we dive in, why don't we hit a polling question? To what extent has your company's revenue been impacted by COVID-19? And we'll give everybody about 30 seconds to respond, and then we'll dive right into our first panel question. For those of you out there, we're going to be doing polling questions throughout. It'll be a bit of a respite from the panel discussion. Okay, let's see what the answers are. To what extent has your company's revenue been impacted by COVID-19? It looks like everyone has been impacted to some degree. It looks like the largest answer is about 0 to 25%. So interesting insight from our attendees. Let's jump in with our first panel question. I'm going to throw this out to all panelists, so we'll just go around the horn. What is your and your company's outlook for the rest of 2020 as we migrate from where we've been to a gradual reopening of the economy? Let's start with Frank.
Thanks, Ross. So for us, unfortunately or unfortunately, people will continue to be diagnosed with cancer. And so I think that we will eventually have the same number of cancer diagnoses as we have historically had. And for us, the big question is when does that cadence, when does it resume normal cadence? And, you know, we've got a situation where correctly or incorrectly, people are so afraid to go to the doctor that they aren't being cared for in some of their more acute conditions. And in our case, cutaneous melanoma has a far higher mortality rate than COVID does. And yet there are people who have a troubling blemish or lesion on their skin, and they aren't being looked at because either they're afraid to go to their doctor or their doctor is afraid to have them come in or their doctor is closed. And so, you know, one thing we know about cancer is in every cancer, the earlier you catch it, the better the prognosis for the patient. So we are carefully watching how long it takes for patients to feel comfortable again. And I think there's going to be stratification there, not only geographically, but also demographically. I think that Medicare patients who make up a large number of, or almost half of melanomas are diagnosed with Medicare patients. That's a population that may unfortunately be slower to return to their normal care patterns, and there's a lot of risk in that. So we are for us, that is the biggest question coming through this epidemic.
That's interesting. How about you, Craig? What's the outlook at Very these days?
Yeah, so a big portion of our business, as I said, is creating flexible workspace solutions for companies, and that's space planning and then complete outfitting of offices with furniture, fixtures. That business has taken a significant drop during the pandemic. Simply, a lot of people aren't in their offices to have product delivered. Certain states we can't deliver products because our installers aren't allowed to go out and deliver products. So we've seen a pretty precipitous fall there. But the light for us in that has been the increase in people buying for work from home. I think as people have gone from typically working maybe a couple hours a day on their sofa at night to now I've got to work 8, 10, 12 hours sitting on my sofa. They're recognizing that they're less productive and starting to feel some aches and pains that they might not otherwise have felt sitting in that static position in a less than perfect seating option. So what we've seen a significant increase in are purchases of electric desks, desktop converters, monitor arms, things that allow people to be more productive and healthier within their home office. And I think as we think about what's how long this is going to extend and wear on, I think we're going to see more of a transition. Corporations saying, hey, we've got to provide people good work environments from home, and they need to have the appropriate tools to be able to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I appreciate your insight there. I think all of us have had some major adjustments to the work from home environment, and I think we're going to see some of that continue more permanently out of this. And we'll talk more about that with some questions later in the panel discussion. VJ, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll talk about it from two sides of it, right? So we're in the consulting business, right? So Bridgepoint, we've looked at it, and we were obviously very concerned as we started off, but pleasantly surprised actually at the number of clients that moved from the projects that they had in place where we had a lot of people on site and things like that, where we were able to move remote and continue to keep the projects going. So that's been amazing how quickly that all has happened. It doesn't mean that we haven't had some impact. We certainly had some projects that have been canceled or delayed as a result of the situation. So we're as one of our managing principals says, we're optimistic as we go forward because we are starting to see more and more projects get green lighted again. So that's been a good sign. Even with I just got off a kickoff meeting where it was completely remote, and that's typically we usually like to be on site and things like that. As I look at it from our CIO group, there's certainly a lot of reprioritization going on as they look forward to where their technology investment's going to be. So obviously they've had to do a lot in the interim to get their people working remotely and shore up their remote capabilities with a lot of ad hoc type of things. But they're also very optimistic, having done this now for over a month of remote, and seeing that productivity is actually not only stayed, but in some cases even improved. They're seeing this as an opportunity as they go into the new norm, that those remote and distributed teams can be and will continue to be effective even in the new norm.
Well, that's certainly a bright spot. Michelle, you want to go next?
Sure. So first I have to say, Craig, one of the impacts on me is that I miss my very desk. So now that I realize it, I am for sure going to be ordering one today. So maybe we can talk after this if there's a discount code I can get from you.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, thank you. That was a good tee up. We have a 10% discount code you can apply online, but I will definitely talk to you afterwards if you'd like to talk about it.
Outstanding.
Thank you. Terrific. So Ross, thanks for the connection here, for the hookup. So private equity is probably a little bit different. We just because of the nature of the space where we operate, meaning in industrials and in OBS, which is outsourced business services, which is largely translated as tech-enabled businesses. We look at this uncertainty and kind of the capital dislocation as creating opportunity. But let me caveat that with we view ourselves more as a white knight than, say, a dark knight here. And that applies both to potential deal and transaction opportunities as well as to our existing portfolio. And what I mean by that is there's one study I read recently that indicated that funds that invested during a recession or during a, let's just call it a challenging time period, had up to a 5% better IRR. And some of this is applied to the use of their operating structure, but some of it is also about their willingness to be acquisitive during more challenging times. So with a new fund, we have a new $500 million fund and the ability to be creative with our capital structures. We are actively seeking opportunities with healthy companies who may just have some challenges right now with capital constraints, whether that's, 1 month in April or part of March, or whether it's a quarter, whatever that is. And so we think it's a good time to be opportunistic, maybe help some of those businesses with minority capital investments now that later becomes a majority. And then as it relates to our portfolio, we think 2020 is going to be a challenging year, but we are all starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, I think the timing of this webinar is very, very good in a sense that you're starting to see the Texas economy reopen. And I'm very encouraged to hear you describe that from Cap Street's perspective. And I think we should all be encouraged with that perspective. Let's go to our next question. This is also going to be for all the panelists. And let's dive a little deeper into kind of what 2020 looks like. As the economies reopen, what's the first 100 days look like at your company or, Michelle, at your portfolio companies in terms of post-pandemic recovery and what adjustments are having to be made, both near-term and long-term, as we get back to work? Let's throw this one out and we'll start with you, Michelle.
Sure. So each portfolio company it's different really for each one because each one is kind of in a different space, from health tech to transportation and logistics to industrial services companies that are supporting, refineries and downstream. So each portfolio company has really worked diligently to prepare various scenarios because we don't know if this is a V or a W or a U or, a long L. And we looked at, what are the triggers for each of those scenarios? Is it backlogs or bookings? And then what are the subsequent actions and plans by each? So depending upon the specific company, some may see a potential V-shaped recovery and are trying to respond to the backlog that's been created over the last 7 weeks for their services. Like Frank was saying earlier, to some degree, there's a backlog for them in terms of testing. So same for us as it relates to our health tech business. And then others, oddly enough, may have seen an uptick in demand, like our transportation and logistics related business. And then others, we see a longer recovery there. And so their first 100 days is a little bit different than the other two. So we're fortunate because we have a diverse portfolio and we're not necessarily as heavily leveraged to some of the more embattled industries. So I think, for us, each business has a different 100 days. And I'll stop with that, Ross.
1 second. Okay, let's go first 100 days at Very, Craig.
Yeah, I'll focus, I guess, on reintegration of people in the workspace. So we've been really focused on trying to, now that we're allowed to come back, trying to figure out how we pilot this so that we can safely bring people back into work. So right now, they've kind of stopped around me for an hour, but right now our team, we've got about 10% of our workforce who's voluntarily coming in and reconfiguring our space. So we're going to introduce 25% of our workforce into the office starting next week, and what that involves is creating larger separation between workstations, using our quick flex wall solution to create more isolated spaces and privacy panels to create privacy between people. We're eliminating conference chairs to create a little bit more spacing. We are creating natural barriers like plants to try to create some of that spacing, as well as sort of directional arrows to direct traffic. From a sanitation standpoint, we've implemented both ultraviolet cell phone sanitizers and hand sanitizing stations throughout the office. We've increased our cleaning staff, and they're just going around and cleaning off work surfaces just constantly to make sure that those surfaces are cleaner. We've also implemented a walk-through temperature gauge in the office, so everybody's going to come through the same door. People will come. We've got shifts, so here's the 15-minute window that I'm coming in the office, so we don't have that typical glut around between 7:30 and 8:30 where everybody's coming in the office. Pylons, so people know as they walk through, then as they wait to walk through the machine, they have enough spacing. And then as they come through, our receptionist is looking, and if somebody reads their temperature reads higher than normal, then we can isolate them and send them home. And then finally, just making sure that people are wearing masks around the office even on the phones, just until we feel like we're at a place where we can see full faces. But you can see people smiling with their masks on, so that's good to see.
And that is outstanding. You guys seem more than prepared for a very careful and thoughtful reopening at Very. That's encouraging to hear. Bridgepoint offices opened yesterday, I would say, in a much kind of less detail. We've done a lot of those same things. We're coming back in phases. We're wearing masks in open areas. We're not congregating in the coffee areas, and we're taking masks off when we're 6 feet away from one another and sitting at our desks. So, that's kind of step one. And I think from a broader perspective, I think we're gonna move forward slowly and carefully and make sure that those folks that are working from home and are two-income families and have kids at home, that they're homeschooling with or virtual schooling. It's created some new dynamics at the home, and those folks will probably continue to work from home, until things get to a better state of normal. From a 100 days perspective, Frank, what's it look like at Castle?
Thanks, Ross. It varies across function for us. We have our lab has stayed open, of course, and has operated normally. That's an essential business. It's a healthcare provider facility, and so that has been uninterrupted because we felt it was important for the patients who were being seen by their doctors and diagnosed with melanoma that they had the chance to have their test run. The biggest change has been in field force, right? So we've got distributed sales and marketing people who have been more or less busy based on their geography, and your view of what's going on in the country, I think for a lot of people is slanted by geography and where you choose to get your news. And if you're in New York, I talk to people in the tri-state, and there's people that literally haven't left their home in 7 weeks, and I applaud them for being well off enough to have all their meals brought in by Uber Eats and having their groceries delivered. But that's sort of one extreme. And you go to other areas of the country where physicians have said, what do you mean close? We got patients that need to be taken care of. Who's going who's going to see my patient if I'm closed? And so for me, the big challenge in that wake up period is how do you evaluate and how do you analyze and evaluate the work that's being done in varied geographies and frankly, the quality of the results, right? Because the great thing about salespeople is they are coin operated, so you can direct behavior. But how do you evaluate the effectiveness of an area manager, for example, who covers Manhattan versus one who covers Little Rock, Arkansas? Because their work opportunities for that first 100 days are significantly different. So how do you evaluate how well they're doing? That to me is the biggest challenge. In terms of the office, we've done what a lot of you have described. We've tried to be. We've gone with rotations. We've got some groups where a third of the group will work from the office each day, and they'll just kind of rotate that through. Our IT guys are doing that. Inside sales support. The finance team, for better or for worse, has continued to come to work. Government lockdowns don't mean you don't have to report financial results. So we still had to get the work done. So it just varies across the group, but those are some things we're thinking about.
Thanks, Frank. Vijay, maybe from a CIO perspective, what do you thinking first 100 days look like?
Yeah, a lot of us are looking at budgets and reevaluating exactly where they're going to prioritize their technology spend and things like that. First of all, I think they're looking at, okay, let's look at remote working as a normal instead of as a exception type of thing. So what does that around equipment investment, around infrastructure investment on those things, and what does that mean from a policy and support perspective when you're having to support a distributed group across the region or whatnot. The other aspects, as I think a little longer term, is how do they, if you will, de-paper or digitize whatever has not been digitized to this point. Because if we looked at the last 7-8 weeks, the technology groups have scrambled to put together quick solutions for those departments that had a lot of paper or that needed a lot of wet signature. So I think you'll see, a lot of technology groups trying to go, do you really need that physical signature? Can we go to e-signature? Do we really need that manual process? What can we do to digitize it so that we can seamlessly move in and out of the situation? Because the ones that were manual took the hardest effort to move remote or had to, go back to the office and those kind of things, right? So I think you'll see a lot more emphasis on that. We may be coming out of it now, but there's no telling what fall brings, right? Or when the next one comes and things like that. So we need to be able to quickly move in and out of these scenarios.
Yeah. Ross, it's Michelle. I just wondered if I could jump in here for a second. I think to me what's interesting about this is that the first 100 days will look different, not just based on what industry you're in, but also the roles that you're in. So, to Frank's point earlier, if you're a salesperson and you can make phone calls and, whatever part of the country you're in, okay, that's one thing. But if you're in an industry where you're on a manufacturing floor, right, that's very different. And so for us as management to be thinking about the different ways that as we bring our teams back, the different ways that they interact, and also the different feelings that those employees have when they come back, right? Because it's one thing to say, oh, well, I can just work in my office and there's no one in a 6-foot area around me. I can just close my door. I can just put my face mask on, right? Versus, well, I'm actually on a shop floor and I have to be in a space with people in order to get my job done. So it's an interesting dilemma for us to kind of have to all figure out depending upon the industries that we run.
I think that's a great perspective. I think I think one thing that will change, certainly at Bridgepoint Consulting, is the face-to-face meetings that we've had in the past are probably going to stay in the past, and I think we're going to probably migrate to a more virtual meeting as the more normal default. And I think as I think about manufacturing companies, distribution companies, I think they're going to probably have to revamp some of their shop floor policies and try to accommodate some of those folks in new ways. I certainly don't have answers, but I think there are going to be some changes that some of the more traditional businesses are going to have to think about going forward. And certainly every individual will have a different perspective on COVID-19, and that perspective is going to have to be respected to some degree. Let's go to another polling question. Have you developed a post-pandemic return to work plan yet? That's an easy one, yes or no. We might not have to wait 30 seconds for that one. And thank you all that are attending for answering these polling questions. Let's see what the results for this one are. Wow, that's great. People are pretty proactive in their view and getting back to work, 71%. Others are probably not in mode to reopen quite yet, so they're going to stay locked down, about 29%. The next question is for you, Michelle. From a PE perspective, what are you seeing in terms of deal flow, and when does that activity kick back up? And even if you had a deal right now, would you be able to close it without meeting the management team face to face?
Yeah, so this relates, I think, to your last point. It used to be, at least, let's say pre-COVID. I don't know if we're going to start saying pre-C at some point, but pre-COVID, a lot of times the conversations would be, you would have investment bankers or lawyers or accountants or different intermediaries come visit and talk about talk about their book, right, which is coming into your office and talking about all the different potential opportunities that are coming up and that may be coming on the market. Well, to your point earlier, I think most of that is going to be on the phone and going forward. So in addition to our, great investment banking partners, a significant amount of our deal flow actually comes through direct sourcing. And I think a lot of private equity firms say, that they wish that was the case, but it really is the case for us. And that is a very significant piece of opportunities for us. And so while that first week in March, I think that was normal from a deal flow perspective, that second week brought what was a surreal collapse with, I think, while everyone, checked on family and friends and took that week off. And then from there, it's really been a roller coaster on the pandemic theme park ride, I guess, where we see one or two opportunities a week, and then we may see 5 to 7 the next, specifically from investment banking firms. But overall, a decline in the same period year over year. With the opportunities that we see or that we source directly, those calls and those contacts, we've continued to reach out, but we've tried to be even increasingly sensitive about timing. And I think we're offering just as much help and sharing of ideas as we are sharing our interest to provide capital, because as I said earlier, we don't want to be perceived as a dark knight. So from a strategy perspective, what we're seeing is not only lighter deal flow overall, but what we're also seeing is that the opportunities that are there where sellers are interested are a little bit different. So we're seeing a lot more in the tech space, opportunities in fintech and health tech and tech services, more SaaS opportunities in general. And on the industrial side, we're seeing opportunities in more critical infrastructure and A&D, more non-cyclical industrial businesses. There have been several bankers who have mentioned that they think we'll start to see more structured capital opportunities midsummer after lenders have really understand the full impact on their portfolios. And of course, we'll look at, opportunities there. But like I said, we're trying to be very sensitive. So in terms of, if we had a deal right now, well, we have been actively looking at opportunities and putting in IOIs and LOIs. We have a couple that we're looking at right now where we are conducting virtual management team meetings. So we haven't closed one yet. I'll let you know, when that happens. Hopefully, not too distant future. So knock on wood, if we can get through the whole process end to end in COVID. But we certainly are, certainly believe we can do a lot virtually, whether it's conducting due diligence or management team meetings or anything in between.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's going to be interesting, as you say, midsummer. I'm encouraged by that, but I also am a realist in thinking that it's going to be very difficult to travel like we used to and really interact face to face like we used to, depending on where we're going or where we're going to be. So I appreciate that firms like Cap Street are embracing virtual meetings and virtual due diligence and even virtual management meetings. I think that's a great trend and step you have to take, I think. Let's pivot over to the CFOs with the next question. So we'll start with Craig. What are the three larger cost levers that you're focused on right now? And what are you doing to adjust those? And what's happening to old budget line items? And what's it look like, coming out of this in 2020 from a kind of cost and expense perspective? What's changed?
Sure. So for us, I think it's largely around cash preservation. When we entered this and we recognized that this was going to have a significant impact and the uncertainty of how long or what the new normal looks like, we set about creating some financial scenarios based off of different tranches of revenue, and then created P&L plans from there, and then looked at the sort of the cash outcomes from a forecasting perspective as a result of that, and then started analyzing, what are the costs that we can. I mean, we've really been focused largely on cost deferment as opposed to cost cutting, but really focusing on that and then side by side working with our BI team on trending models to make sure that we have the financial discipline in place, but we also know when we're headed towards that next waterfall to be able to execute on that. But I think to answer your question, it's been largely on deferment. So for instance, our technology roadmap, we were in the process of evaluating ERP, HRIS, PLM systems, and we've said, okay, maybe right now we continue baling wire and duct tape, right, until we know what it looks like longer term. So a lot of the technology roadmap has been put on hold. We've also frozen all non-revenue generating or non-essential budgeted or backfill roles for the time being. And then I think the third thing is just sort of pushing out some of our marketing dollars. 2 months ago, we did a rebrand from Veridesk to Very, and we had several $1 million invested in that rebrand. We've kind of said, look, maybe we don't have a captive audience right now to introduce that right now, so let's push some of that out. So really, largely for us, it's been more around cost deferment until we understand what we're looking at rather than cost cuts.
And just while we're on that, and then we'll go over to Frank, what triggers are you looking for? What milestones are you looking for to maybe free up some of those investment dollars, maybe in the ERP front or maybe the marketing campaign?
I think that's where the revenue trending is helpful. So our RBI team, we work together to create some trending models that take into account our recent revenue trends, sort of macroeconomic indicators and trends, as well as our pipeline, and say, okay, what is, how is that going? And I think once we, similarly as we head down, so obviously as we were just talking about, we saw this sort of this demand panic that happened when all of this first happened, and now so we saw some some falls in our revenue, what we've seen is then we saw it flatten out. Now we're starting to see it come back around, right? So similar to what we're doing going down, we're also saying as we go up, here are some things we can layer back in from a prioritizing based off of what helps us accelerate out of this most quickly, and we can start layering in some of those marketing dollars, some of those hires, some of that software implementation.
Yeah, terrific. That's a great perspective, Frank. When you look at Castle, what are some of the main cost levers you've had to deal with in terms of what it looked like before and what it might look like now?
So the biggest area that we've looked at for changes in cost structure are within that outside sales and marketing effort. And I thought Michelle's comment is interesting about I was an investment banker for almost 25 years, and I don't know how many of those meetings going through pitch books I've been in. And it's interesting. It'll be interesting to me to see if they really don't return, because the reason you got on a plane and flew across the country to sit down across the table from somebody was because it was more effective than doing it by phone. If it were as effective to do it by phone, that's the way we'd have done it all along. And we have a similar view with our sales and marketing effort. They're doing the best they can with virtual meetings and online and telehealth, et cetera. But the reality is that if it were as effective to market to physicians across the phone, we'd have done it that way all along. So we made the decision, we did a lot of analysis, and we made the decision not to furlough anybody. And in fact, we've continued our hiring plans and have hired through this situation. Now, we're fortunate in that we were very disciplined with capital. Not many companies of our scale generate cash, and we did generate cash last year. We were able to upsize our IPO last year, which again was fortunate. And so we went into this with what I am committed to retaining, which is a fortress balance sheet that's enabled us to build the company for 2021 and not to try to get through the next couple of quarters in the most efficient fashion. Now, I recognize that's not a universal posture. And by the way, if people continue to stay home and not go to the doctor, when we do this in 6 months, I'll have a different answer for you. But at the end of the day, 130,000 people were diagnosed with melanoma last year, and they're going to be 130,000 diagnosed in 2021. So we're trying to make sure we're in place to cover that marketplace going forward. And it's interesting, and one thing that people should really think about, when you talk about furloughs, there's two sides to that spreadsheet, right? There's a spreadsheet where you say, okay, we're going to furlough this many. Here's the comp savings we're going to save. Here's the severance or the termination deals we're going to make if you decide to make them. And here's the net savings. But what a lot of my peers have not, when I talk through their spreadsheets with them, I say, well, where in your numbers did you put in the recruiter costs? Ross, you got a very nice partner company that does good recruiting work for us, and they don't do that for free. So if I furlough 15 people, I got to find a way to rehire them. And by the way, one of my competitors might have picked them up in the interim. So it's a 3D model that we went through to try to determine what to do, and that's just where we came out. And it can be challenged. And as I said, in 6 months, I may say, gosh, I wish I'd tweaked that spreadsheet just a little bit. But for right now, that's the way we've approached it.
That's a good perspective. Let's go to another polling question. I know we got to get through these, so the guys that are on the phone, women and men on the phone, get their CPE. Did your company have to convert from on-site data management to the cloud during this pandemic? I know there are a lot of companies that were already in the cloud, and there were some that weren't. So I'm sure this was a transition for those that weren't. We'll leave about 15 more seconds, and we'll check the answer. BJ, I'll throw the next question to you once we get this polling question answered.
Got it.
Did your company have to convert from on-site data management to the cloud? Wow, an overwhelming no. So, wow, the cloud is, a lot of the companies have already made that transition to the cloud pre-pandemic, which made the work from home transition much easier for you folks. I know Bridgepoint has been in the cloud for a while, and we're a remote, dispersed workforce, so it was fairly straightforward for us. Let's go to you, VJ, with the next question. How has the pandemic impacted how CIOs view their company's risk, both near term and long term?
Yeah, there's several things to consider around that, but I'll touch on that poll question just since that was up. You know, during the event is not one of the, not the best of times to convert, right? Because they're already on site. To make that move is not going to be the best time to do it. But post-pandemic or I think that you will see a lot more companies move in that area for those that haven't. And so on the risk side, you also tying into the previous question, I see a lot of companies moving to SaaS type models on their technology investment, both on the software side as well as their infrastructure. So I see that, if your licensing is based on buying, server licenses or chunks of things, you're going to see more and more people moving towards, use-based license like SaaS models for a majority. That gives them that flexibility. So if things go ramp up really quick or ramp down that need to be ramped down, we can, vary that cost in the CIO's budget, and both on the infrastructure as well as on the software side. Now, on the risk side, that introduces a lot of new risks on that end, right? So we're all relying, as we move to the cloud and whatnot, we're all going to be relying on a shared infrastructure that, let's say it's Amazon or Azure from Microsoft or whoever else that is there. And some of the numbers I saw especially when the first stimulus checks started to come in, some of the banks, they were experiencing 200, 300% increase in their IT needs on processing all of those checks and things like that from what they were used to, right? So if we're all moved off to this shared infrastructure like AWS or Azure, what does that mean? Are they going to start pricing for priority? Are they going to start pricing for reserving space in their different environments and those kind of things? So those are going to be things I think we're going to think of. The other risk I think people are going to need to think about are policies associated with remote working and what do they expect from their employees and things like that, because now the company network has been extended out, right? Yes, we're all using VPNs and things like that, but now endpoint detection and protection becomes much more challenging in those kind of remote environments and things like that.
Thanks, Vijay. Let's go ahead and knock out the last polling question. In response to the areas we covered today, where does your company need to focus most coming out of the pandemic? IT infrastructure, raising capital, company right sizing, risk management, and then they all catch-all phrase, other. There is a Q&A available to the attendees. I'm seeing some questions pop up in that Q&A, so we'll try to leave some time here at the end to address one or two of those questions if we can. Okay, let's go to the results of the polling question. So it looks like company right sizing and risk management are leading the leading areas of focus coming out of the pandemic, and to a lesser extent, raising capital and IT infrastructure. I think all that tells me is, coming into this pandemic, we were in one of the strongest economic growth phases we've seen in a while. So companies had capital and had invested in some IT infrastructure. So not overly surprising, but also interesting at the same time. Why don't we throw this over to you, Michelle? What are you seeing at the portfolio companies? I know you've got a lot of industries you're in. Your portfolio covers your portfolio companies are in a lot of different industries, but what have you seen over the last 2 months that are going to impact the rest of the year?
Well, I think some of it has already been mentioned. So, some of it has to do with the decline in one of the, in some of the portfolio companies' revenue means having to make some very tough changes around personnel and labor and salaries and furloughs and things like that. But at the same time, there are some of those same businesses where we had to make some of those tough decisions, where now we're starting to see them need to fulfill the backlog, and so being able to bring some of those employees back, which is great. So it's really varied, as you said, based on the individual business. We had one business where sales were down about 20% for some of their core products, but they were able to pivot and supply face shields to Houston hospitals, which is not something that they had produced prior. So I attribute that to also being able to, kind of think creatively, think differently during that time period. But then that impacts, as impacts them going forward, is that another industry that they can begin to supply that they hadn't considered being, providing in the past. So I think it'll be different for each individual company.
Thank you. We're about 6 or 7 minutes from the end of our time. I had some other prepared questions, but why don't we go to the Q&A chat for just a second? Here's a question. I'll start with you, Craig. How has the pandemic and shelter-in-place order impacted the overall culture at Berry? Have you seen a change in the culture?
That's a great question. So much of our culture is around collaboration and even to the extent that when our founders created the building, they made one coffee bar as a central location, so that no matter, if you were on the other side of the building, you could still, run into somebody and have a conversation. I think that, much like everybody, we had this initial moment of sort of panic, like, how's this going to work? How are we going to stay connected? I think that, first of all, I think Jason McCann, our CEO, has done an amazing job of continually making sure that people feel connected and updated. He has a weekly sort of state of the business conversation that he's having with everybody on Zoom, where we're able to look at each other. I think, and that's waterfalled through. I'm having daily chats with my entire team, in addition to my regular daily stand-up with my leadership team. And then, for me, and again, just trying to make sure that everybody still feels connected and nobody feels isolated. I think in addition to that, I'm making it a point a couple times a day to try to call people on my team just to see how they're doing. We're all dealing with these sort of this crazy sort of polar opposite experience. I've got 80% of my team is under the age of 30. So you've got a large chunk of people who are dealing with isolation because they're in their apartment or their home by themselves, right? Versus, the other chunk of the population that's dealing with having to be at home the entire time for the first time, 24/7 with their husbands and kids and wives and partners. So just checking in and having conversations and letting them know that we still care about them, addressing whatever concerns they have. Obviously we're in a great position to provide. We've surveyed our employees and made sure that distributed product to make sure that they can work from home and have all the tools that they need to work from home. So that's been great as well. And then finally, our PR team has done a terrific job with a communication plan. So beyond that, there's plenty of communication going on that's celebrating accomplishments of people on the team, on different teams, and generally updating people on, this is what the next phase we're walking into, and this is what it's going to look like when you get there. So I guess in short, it's really about just regular communication.
Sounds like improved communication and a real effort on that front at Berry. Frank, any changes or impacts to the culture at Castle Biosciences you can touch on?
I hope not. But I think some of it's inevitable. I think that, they say it only takes 21 days for somebody to learn a new habit, right? To adopt and for that to become ingrained. And, I think there's a lot of people who, to Craig's point, have been figured out how to work from home, and they're going to have to figure out how to not work from home again, which will be another transition. We've done some of the things described. We've tried to make sure people feel connected to the company and make sure that they recognize that the company feels connected to them. That's a key here, is making sure that people who are physically isolated, don't get the feling that they've been forgotten and that their efforts aren't being noticed, the quality of their work isn't being noticed. We're talking about things we've never talked about at Castle. VJ, we're talking about how do you implement these systems that allow us to monitor what people are doing when they're working from home. Are they logged on, or is their computer open and they're watching Netflix, or is it open and they're working? We got to figure out all that. And we've never thought like that at Castle. That's never been part of our culture. And, we will have to change some of the culture, unfortunately. But we are working hard trying to keep it as close to what it was before.
Yeah, Frank, that's some good points. I would say at Bridgepoint, one thing I think I can clearly note that's changed in our culture for the good is we've become much more empathetic. I think we were an empathetic listening firm going into this, but I think, in the midst of a storm and coming out of the storm, I think as a management team, as a team of consultants, I think we've become much more empathetic listeners, both amongst each other and with our clients and prospects. So, we're running out of time. Why don't we do this? Why don't we just leave this one last question? And if you guys on the panel can kind of limit it to maybe 15 to 30 seconds, I'm gonna ask that you try to do that because we're about 2 to 3 minutes from being over. What's your one piece of parting advice for the business leaders that are out there listening, to guide their organization from pandemic to post-pandemic and the economy reopening? Why don't we start with you, Craig?
I think it's about having a plan, but being flexible. We have to make sure that we can roll with the punches. We can change and adapt because none of us definitively know what's going to happen. So it's about, yes, absolutely having a plan, but constantly evaluating it and making sure that you've got flexibility, ingrained so that you can adapt quickly.
Yeah, great. Michelle?
Sure. Not to make this too global, but Ross, I sure hope that we all have learned a bit of empathy, not just your firm. But mine would be that, we can't control the situation. We can't control if there's a pandemic. We can't control if there's a recession. But the one thing you can control is how you respond.
That's great advice. Frank?
I would say we will all be better on the other side of this than we were going in. Anybody can run a company when times are good. And, whatever your lens to this question is, when the tide's rising, your boat's going to go up. But we're all going to learn a lot through this, and we're all going to be better at what we do.
Thanks, Frank. That's great. VJ, last but not least.
So I would say, you hit on flexibility. That's going to be important. Resiliency, right? Because coming in and out, I do think we're going to be kind of in this situation for a while of going in and out and those kind of things. And last, I don't think we go back to completely the way we were, right? And that there's some good things that come out of it that we do learn and need to move forward in. And I think we can look at this as an experience to build on for really a lot of things we can learn from this and improve, whether as a company or as a society.
Yeah, I think I would add one thing, and then we'll turn it back over to FEI. I guess my piece of advice is let's not get back to the new normal. Let's look forward to the new normal, and let's do it with optimism and hopefully, as Frank said, we'll be better than we were before the pandemic because we have been tested and will have come out the other side. So with that, thank you to all the panelists. I appreciate you guys participating. I will turn it back over to Gary with FBI.
Great. Thank you, Ross. This has really been an incredibly relevant discussion, especially in today's environment, that we're all adapting to. So, I wanted to thank Ross and our panelists for their time and sharing their insights and perspectives today. Also, a special thank you to Holly, Tommy, and Lucas from Bridgepoint for assembling such an amazing panel for us today. And in closing, just wanted to mention that FEI Austin is hosting another few webinars coming up. The locked-in dates right now are May 21st, May 27th, and June 3rd. More details to come. Thank you all for joining today. Really appreciate your time and hope everyone is staying healthy and continuing to thrive in the new environment. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you all soon. Back to
This
Michelle.
marks the end of our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us on future webinars. You can find information about upcoming webinars in the resources widget. If you have any questions regarding CPE credits, please feel free to email cpe@financialexecutives.org. Once again, have a wonderful day, and thank you to all of our speakers for today's webinar.
Word.